All right, thank you very much, Saba, and it's good to be with you. I suppose we're starting. So let me just say that my name is Dimitris Tsarouhas, and I'm a professor of international relations and comparative politics. And what I will be talking about today is, as you mentioned a bit earlier, Brexit, the European Union's future, and what this means going forward for international politics. And of course, I think it's rather important to start by saying that when we agreed to have this discussion or this talk, it seems, the world was a different one, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine had not yet happened. And the reason why I want to mention this at the very beginning is because I think that what we have now is a completely different situation within which we can talk about phenomena such as Brexit. Let me try and explain this a little bit over the next few minutes. The first thing to say, I think, is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is changing some of the calculations that the European Union was making in the aftermath of Brexit and trying to go forward following a catastrophic pandemic. So the argument was that Brexit can be treated as an isolated phenomenon, pretty much. The argument was that Europe's unity verified and confirmed through the actions it took in the summer of 2020, the adoption of the Next Generation EU program, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, would allow Europe to bounce back. And of course, that bouncing back was also premised on the idea that the similarly minded administration in Washington, the election of Joe Biden, that is, would cement the transatlantic alliance and bring together this coalition of democracies that would be able to fight against crises that now appear to be happening more and more frequently. So one may wonder, what's the importance of Brexit here? I mean, my argument is the following. My argument is that Brexit and the election of Donald Trump back in 2016, because the two phenomena happened very closely, right? So Britain voted to leave the EU in the summer, and in November of 2016 of the same year, Donald Trump got elected. Those were the early and clear warning signs that something very important was happening in the Western world, but also beyond the Western world. That the old balance of power and the old assumptions about how the international system worked were crumbling from within. And so from within Western societies, what was emerging was a massive wave of disappointment, anger towards a system, a political and economic system that appeared not to be delivering anymore, that appeared to be morally bankrupt, that appeared to be catering to the interests of the few and leave the many behind. And Brexit emerged, and of course the first thing that would happen under these circumstances is that the EU very successfully came together, negotiated for a very long time with the United Kingdom. Britain went through all sorts of turbulence. It had a change of political leadership a number of times. He had elections a number of times. And eventually Britain exited the EU. And the argument then was, right, now that this major stumbling block has been overcome, in essence, Europe can go back to do business as usual, right? And when I say business as usual, please do remember one of the reasons that, well, there were two basic reasons in my mind that contributed to Brexit. The first was migration, and the way in which the issue of migration was manipulated and exploited by politicians in the UK and of course in Europe as well for electoral gain. And the second reason that contributed to the phenomenon of Brexit in the way that it actually occurred was the Eurozone crisis, where Europe was thrown into the midst of a major economic recession, and particularly the weaker members had to be bailed out by the stronger ones. Now, Britain didn't want to play any role in this, and that hardened opinions in the UK about the inability of the European Union to deal with its problems. So the combination of a long-running migration crisis in the UK and indeed in Europe in 2015 and 2016, was then combined with the inept handling of the EU and led to Brexit. And then once the Brexit negotiations were concluded, and on the part of Europe, it seems to have done a good job, the argument was we can basically move on and forget what happened in the past. And the problem is you can't forget, and your own people do not forget. And so very soon afterwards, we ended up with a pandemic crisis. Please do remember that Europe's handling of the pandemic crisis was very, very criticized at the beginning, and it was seen as inept and counterproductive until it managed to come to a general agreement as to where it stands. That is to say, it adopted the Next Generation EU program, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and gave the impression, and indeed I have written about this, that this is a window of opportunity for the EU to move forward. For the first time, the EU as one single actor is going to borrow in international markets. For the first time, the EU is offering grants to its member states. Let's make no mistake. These efforts by the EU are there for it to consolidate its position. And I think that there is now an understanding in Brussels that the stakes are very high, that Brexit may not have been an isolated phenomenon, that the fear of Euroscepticism or anti-Europeanism, if you like, remains. We have seen the recent results in France to suggest that Euroscepticism, and in some cases virulent Euroscepticism, is still very popular. And so for all of these reasons, Europe wants to consolidate itself, to remain strong and united around one agenda. And the fact that Donald Trump is no longer the US president and Joe Biden has been elected in his stead appears to be favoring that momentum. But my argument today is that if one was to read the developments of the last few years solely from this light, so if we were simply to assume that Europe went through a crisis with Brexit and the Eurozone crisis and the pandemic crisis, as everyone else did, but it's now in a better place, that would be a wrong reading. I think that the war between Russia and Ukraine is highlighting the extent to which the world has changed. It's highlighting some of the vulnerabilities of the European Union. And I think it's also highlighting how the Western world as a whole is no longer in a position to obtain from the rest of the international community what it wants under its own terms. And let me try to explain. The war has highlighted the extent to which Europe is dependent, energy dependent on Russia. And if we don't know much about the war, because obviously it's difficult to get accurate and objective reporting from the theater of operations. So the Russians will say one thing, the Ukrainians will say another. What we do know is that it's now becoming increasingly difficult for Europe, regardless of the sanctions that it has imposed on the Russians, to continue getting natural gas and oil from the Russian Federation, and very many of the EU member states depend on it. So regardless of Brexit, regardless of the challenge that some member states and some governments pose to the liberal credentials of the EU, and I'm thinking especially of Hungary and Poland, regardless of all the existing challenges, there is now an even bigger challenge. And that is, could it be that Europe is overreaching in its approach to the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Could it be that it's becoming so vulnerable, given its dependence on Russian energy sources, that its own citizens will come to pay the price? And if we take some of the warnings aired by the European Commission and other officials over the last few days, that appears to be a very real possibility. That is to say that European citizens will need to reduce their energy consumption by obligatory telework, by parking their cars on Sunday and going by foot or bike, and similar measures that we have seen for the last time more than 50 years ago during the 1970s crisis. Now, why am I talking about this? Why am I talking about the challenge of Europe? I'm saying all this because I think that in the Russia-Ukraine war, the European Union has made a calculation that the very stringent sanctions imposed on Putin and his regime are going to bite, are going to be effective, and that the international community is going to be on the side of the EU and the United States in condemning the Russian invasion. I think the sanctions will work, and they will work in the medium and long run. The extent to which this is going to punish the Russian people is still uncertain. But when it comes to the international community, this is where the big problem lies, I think. It is quite clear that, with the exception of some solid allies, such as Japan, Korea, or Australia, the rest of the international community has failed to take the action that Europe was expecting it to take vis-à-vis Russia. And what that then means, of course, is that both on the theater of operations and also from a broader political perspective, the Russian regime now can afford to continue delaying, if you like, to continue fighting the war by entrenching itself on Ukrainian territory, but without being able to make the inroads that will lead to a Ukrainian surrender. In other words, what I think most analysts agree on right now is that this war is not going to finish anytime soon. It's going to be a long and protracted conflict where stasis will characterize what will happen. And that is bad news for Europe. So, overcoming the challenges of Brexit and the esoteric challenge of the rise of authoritarian tendencies by some governments is by now, in the year 2022, only one of the problems that the EU is facing, maybe not even the biggest one. The biggest problem now appears to be how to make sure that Europe doesn't shoot itself on the foot, how it doesn't overreach, and how, and I think that's very important, the crisis which has been brought about by the Russian invasion does not become a much bigger crisis of a humanitarian character, of food shortages and popular revolts as a result of the inability of Russia and Ukraine to export foodstuffs, especially grain, to the rest of the world. And the reason why this matters for Europe is because, given its geographic proximity to the MENA region, the possibility of huge instability in the Middle East and North Africa, the possibility, that is, of food shortages, a massive rise in poverty and famine, will lead to more migration. It will lead to forced migration that Europe simply cannot shut down. The argument that Europe now has a handle on migration, the argument that through the agreement with Turkey, for instance, Europe is in a position to somehow manage its external borders by securitizing them, by pushing back migrants, is simply not true. And so the amount of challenges that Europe is facing at one and the same time, I think, makes clear that a new set of priorities needs to be set. The European Union is no longer in a position, I think, to preach to the rest of the world about what the rest of the world should do. I think it makes a lot more sense for Europe to decide itself what it wants to do. Excuse me, and what is in the interest of its own people at a time of massive crisis. So, to be a bit more practical, let me just say a couple of words about what all this means. Some European leaders are now increasingly making, I think, the right call. And I'm referring to President Macron of France and Prime Minister Draghi of Italy, who have said, and I think that should be the goal of the EU, in contrast to maybe the UK or the US, the goal in the Russia-Ukraine conflict should be to stop the war. The overwhelming objective should be to stop the war. stopping the war and making sure that there is a cessation of hostilities and some kind of political dialogue between the two sides is inevitable if we want to see some sort of return to normalcy, some sort of return to stability. Anything else is simply going to continue compounding the problem. And what many European leaders, I think, are now realizing is that unless we do manage to have peace in a relatively short period of time, those underlying challenges that they've been facing, the rise of populism, the disintegration of the European Union through Brexit, rising Euroscepticism, anti-immigrant sentiment, all of those things are simply going to continue and rise further. And of course, if that scenario was to play out, if indeed we ended up in a situation where there is going to be protracted conflict, and Europe, of course, will continue imposing harsh sanctions, and of course, you know, bear the brunt of those sanctions itself, it is quite easy to imagine a scenario in which large parts of the European electorate, seeing their living standards fall, seeing their energy consumption reduced beyond their will, they may revolt against their own political establishment. So I guess what I'm trying to say is Europe has been able to handle and negotiate the aftermath of the Brexit situation rather successfully, because it managed to remain united and it managed to negotiate with successive British governments in a way that did not undermine its internal cohesion. But the developments of the last 3 to 4 years are suggesting a couple of things. First, we continue to live in a very uncertain world. We are now in an era of polycrisis, of multiple crises, and Brexit was only one of them. Second, some of the structural forces that eventually led the UK to withdraw from the European Union continue to exist in other EU member states, and they're not only limited to Eastern Europe, we also have them in Western European states, and therefore the danger for the EU disintegrating further continues. And third, and I think that's probably the most important point, for all of the changes that have been brought about in the last 3 to 4 years, the European Union fundamentally continues to be absent from the major political negotiation points of the international system. The European Union continues, despite the fact that we now live in a radically different world, to rely fundamentally on the United States for its own security and protection. It continues to perceive of itself and act by way of an economic superpower that it is, but is not in a position to complement this with its political power. And in that sense, we may be approaching a time when some major decisions will need to be made. And what I mean by this is, if the relative value added that the European Union offers to its citizens declines, some may say continues to decline, and despite the achievements made since Brexit and during the pandemic, it may be time to start thinking and pondering about loud how to revolutionize the existence of the European Union, how to transform and change an institutional structure that seems to be too slow and too cumbersome in terms of how it manages to react to different phenomena. And in that sense, for instance, on foreign and security policy, moving away from the right of national vetoes may become an inescapable reality, may become something that the EU will have to introduce. It will have to introduce majority votes, because otherwise it simply cannot continue to be pulled apart from different national preferences at a time of major crisis. So just to conclude this, and as I said from the beginning, the Russia invasion of Ukraine is changing a lot of the assumptions that we believed we knew about and worked accordingly over the last few years. The European Union's position has been exposed as particularly vulnerable in the context of that invasion for reasons more than one. Economically and politically, Europe is suffering the consequences of that invasion, and a cessation of hostilities and a return to peace is by far the biggest, the best outcome that the European Union can hope for. However, given the trends that we observe in the current conflict and the possibility of this becoming a protracted conflict between the two sides, not to mention the possibility of Western involvement, of course. Given this protracted conflict, I think Europe needs to act very quickly in terms of revamping its decision-making structures, in terms of making sure that the notion of safety and security is returned to the European citizens in order to fight against the rising Eurosceptic waves. And finally, it needs to try and reach out to governments and regimes across the world that do not fulfill Europe's liberal democratic credentials and yet are absolutely crucial in terms of, at the very least, guaranteeing that the United Nations Charter on Peace and Security in the international system will be preserved. And I'm talking here about countries in the Middle East. I'm talking about countries in South Asia. I'm talking about reaching out to countries with which the European Union has had rather problematic relations for a long time. And so with these thoughts, I want to sort of bring these remarks to an end. I want to thank you for having me. And you did mention earlier that you are not going to be asking questions, but I prefer to be asked questions so as to have a more interactive discussion. But, thank you for listening to me.